Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 299. It's still relatively close to the Halloween season, so this week we're going to be talking about some Giallo stuff.
야, 날 완전 제대로 잡아.
That probably is a good question. Just what the heck is Giallo?
You might ask.
It's the Italian word for yellow, but initially in the context that we're talking about, it referred to a series of sort of crime mystery pulp novels published in Italy by the Arnaldo Mondadori company, dating back to the 30s. A lot of times these were translations of foreign authors, and the front covers of the books always had yellow backgrounds, hence they were called Il Giallo Mondadori, Mondadori Yellows. And eventually, Giallo also became a synonym for any kind of murder mystery type of thing, particularly in southern Italy. But sometime in the late 40s, so immediately after that thing that happened in Europe with the and these gialli started to make their way into Italian motion pictures. And by the late 60s, it had pretty much spawned an entire new genre of cinema entitled giallo. That kind of became the new big thing in Italian movies after the peplum bloom, all those great Hercules movies we love so much.
Sandstorm.
By the time giallo crystallized as a genre, it wasn't really about the mystery much anymore. You could never really predict the plot twist at the end of these films. Instead, it was way more about extremely graphic violence, especially for the time, as well as a lot of really interesting stylistic stuff. Very psychedelic kind of movies, almost like moving paintings, weaving a tapestry of this psychedelic sort of death. A lot of them had really weird titles too, almost sounded like Dark Tranquility lyrics, stuff like The Iguana with the Tongue of Fire, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Blood and Black Lace, Twitch of the Death Nerve. But the reason that you as a metal listener might be familiar with the word giallo is this genre of film had a huge influence on Goregrind, to the point where Impetigo's second demo from 1989 is just called Giallo. It made sense. I mean, especially Twitch of the Death Nerve basically invented the slasher movie template. And the band we're talking about this week, Blue Holocaust, a Goregrind solo project out of France, basically took their love for giallo farther than I've heard any other band take it. The debut album, literally entitled Twitch of the Death Nerve, that came out in 2004, is kind of a love letter to that whole era of cinema and attempts to recreate that sort of bizarre atmosphere through the medium of grindcore. And well, I'd say the man was successful not only in capturing that giallo spirit, but also in creating one of the strangest, most unique, and best Goregrind albums released to date. The heavy emphasis on groove and texture really captures that essence of 70s sleaze that was so important to giallo. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this is the most accessible Goregrind album ever. In fact, it's one of the most deliberately nasty sounding ones. The faint of heart are probably better off sticking with Carcass and Hemorrhage, but it is one of the more unique examples of the genre. And despite how deliberately dirty sounding it is, every song, over the course of its 32-track runtime, manages to have something memorable about it. It also has perhaps the best incorporation of samples I've ever heard in this kind of album. Like how at the end of this track, everything collapses into the actual theme of the movie that all the lyrics in the song were about. And honestly, the melodic character of that theme fits with the deceptively melodic riffs kind of hiding inside all of that Goregrind murk.
아니, 원스 여러분들이
That's right, I said melody. A mocking, sinister sense of melody that's one of this album's most defining features.
You have killed. And you will kill again.
Another defining feature of this album would be Pierre, the guitarist and songwriter's talent for writing these very percussive, catchy riffs that really stick out amongst the grindcore soup. But this rather sardonic-sounding pair of riffs in the song Deep Red, named after the Dario Argento movie, definitely demonstrate the sort of sinister melody that he's working with. Particularly when they're continuously alternated with the more percussive riff phrases. It's almost like he's lunging in, stabbing you, then pulling back to laugh before coming back in to stab you again. Blue Holocaust is somewhat similar to bands like Lymphatic Phlegm or Lipoma in that a lot of their more melodic grindcore phrases border on black metal at times, like this melody right here. It's very consonant and flowing, despite the very punk-influenced Goregrind trappings that encase it. And as I intimated earlier, there's a real sense of sinister mockery to the proceedings, gloating over the corpse of a victim. There's also a very effective usage of counterpoint. With a a lot of songs having these like tempo shifts and turnarounds, bouncing different riff ideas off of each other. And because of that, despite the fact there are 32 very short and very noisy gore grind tracks in this album, at least for my ears, they're all pretty darn memorable and catchy. I initially listened to this album a whole lot, maybe 5 years after it came out, then came back to it a few years later after that, and I was surprised I remember basically how every track went. Speaking of that percussive stuff I was talking about earlier, there's also quite a lot of influence from old school thrash metal and old school death metal. For instance, the title track of the album, Twitch of the Death Nerve, starts out with a very thrashy barrage of percussive riffs that maintain that 80s thrash metal quality even as they kind of shift to a more grindy structure, before then heading into something that almost kind of sounds like autopsy worship. I mean, eventually it goes back to grindcore, but don't worry about that autopsy shit, only making a short appearance.
You'll get that back!
And then some at the end of this grindcore section, where that autopsy style riff set is expanded upon quite a bit, very much the sort of melodies that Danny Corrales and Chris Reefer would be proud of. We're then jumping into my personal favorite riff on the album, which is just total churning death thrash goodness. Incredibly heavy, incredibly catchy, and incredibly memorable, which also very much describes this album as a whole. And it gets better the farther you get into it, so by the time you get to the closing track and you're hit with this gore grind epic entitled Under the Eyes of the Assassin, you're hitting probably the closest Blue Holocaust ever gets to straight up carcass worship, and it's incredibly well done with these really groovy, memorable riffs that almost have sort of a morbid dance-like feeling to them. They're almost kind of silly sounding, but they're also incredibly morbid in tone, and it keeps building until the song collapses. Another great mid-song sample, and then we're getting to some much more chaotic sounding grindcore, almost kind of bordering on more of a death grind sound with these incredibly spastic sounding stop-start riffs. That's what you get with Blue Holocaust, a whole lot of great variety of different styles of grindcore mixed up into this nasty mush. The cherry on top being that amazing cover art which fits the music perfectly and is both beautiful and disgusting in its collage of gore and giallo iconography.
Holy fuck, is this wrong? But holy hell, is it erotic?
A lot of times people like to say their favorite death metal album is like the musical equivalent of a horror movie. And this one time I saw Impetigo described not like being in a horror movie, but rather getting drunk and watching a whole bunch of horror movies on tape. Blue Holocaust is like dropping acid and watching a whole bunch of giallo movies, but you're also in hell. Specifically, the sixth layer of Bator, Malbolge, which is made up entirely of just a bunch of organs stitched together, belching out pus. It's ruled over by Glacia, the bratty daughter of Asmodeus, after she deposed the hag countess who...
너는 산이야 바다야?
Yeah, you're right, enough of that nerd shit. Point is, Blue Holocaust unquestionably put out one of the greatest modern grindcore albums, with Twitch of the Death Nerve way back when. And after that, I kind of lost track of them. Between roughly 2014 to like 2018-ish, I decided to pay attention to politics for some reason.
Haha, you fool! You fell victim to one of the classic blunders!
Yeah, wouldn't recommend doing that. Big mistake. And during that time, I kind of lost track of Blue Holocaust. But it turns out this project kept going. And it took a real long time, but in 2018, he finally put out a new full-length album entitled Flesh for the Cannibal God, and guess what?
There is some sort of harmony. It is the harmony of overwhelming and collective murder.
Hey, that's my sample, you can't use that. Anyways, this album's also spectacular. It's a little bit more on the death grind side this time around, and in the intervening years, he actually learned how to drum, so this album's got acoustic drums on it. He's still doing everything, just the one guy, and it all sounds great. Thick, heavy, groovy, gross, punk-influenced, gore grind stuff. It's like he never left. Speaking of groove, check out this set of riffs right here. Almost kind of a Celtic Frost-style black thrashy thing, forcibly mangled into a gore grind context, followed up by some very foreboding-sounding, doomy grindcore riffs that break things up a bit before we get back into the gory thrashing. This album's great, but like, what was he doing all those years? Well, Pierre was running his zine entitled Brain Dead, covering lots of good gore grind bands like Lymphatic Phlegm and such. He did album cover art and logos for a whole bunch of underground bands, and he even started another entire band, this time with a full lineup so they could play live shows called Vomi Noir, or Black Vomit. And this is cool because now you can actually go see this guy live. Like, look, there he is on stage. He's doing all like the weird Goregrind vocals, playing the Goregrind riffs, having a good old Goregrind time. You'll love to see it. And Vomit Noir are pretty sick on record, too. They're a little bit more standard Goregrind sounding than the insanity that is Blue Holocaust. But you can definitely tell it's still the same fella writing all the guitar riffs. I mean, he's got a pretty unmistakable sort of character to his melodies. And like with Blue Holocaust, these songs got lots of cool change-ups in them. But man, is it ever weird seeing really long French song titles with a whole lot of accent marks, and it's not black metal, you know what I mean? Anyways, here's another really good groove riff that transitions into an equally well-done grindcore iteration of itself. So yeah, Vomit Noir, great band, and probably more well-known at this point than Blue Holocaust, but for me, Blue Holocaust is that good shit. And this new album doesn't disappoint. Instead of going with the full-on Giallo angle, he went more into the world of Italian mondo cannibal films, which admittedly I am not as much of a fan of. You know, those wacky sort of like pseudo-documentary ones like Cannibal Holocaust or Man from Deep River, Green Inferno or whatever. That said, definitely good lyrical content mined for a Goregrind band.
Eat or be eaten.
This album's a little bit more accessible in its sound and influences than Twitch of the Death Nerve was. I hear a whole lot of Repulsion in it, and everybody loves Repulsion.
Stuff from Repulsion. I didn't even see him. I love Repulsion. Oh yeah, fucking Black Breath, yeah.
Other concessions to the more death-like sound include more of an emphasis on guitar solos, but don't worry, those are still warped enough to fit the overall grindcore savagery. Speaking of which, the groove riffs on this album, perhaps even heavier this time around. And like Twitch of the Death Nerve before it, this album gets better the further you get into it. Towards the end, he starts throwing in all sorts of wacky influences. That's kind of the big appeal of Blue Holocaust for me, is seeing this churning sort of grindcore soup and figuring out what's going to rise to the top to distinguish each song. Towards the end, he starts throwing in even more Autopsy-styled sort of death doom of the filthiest variety. A lot more experimentation with minimalism this time around. Yet these arrangements are also very lush. They even kind of dip into sort of soundtracky territory, working in lead guitar melodies that almost sound like half-remembered recollections of Giallo movie themes, kind of winding their way around the percussive core of the music. Flesh for the Cannibal God is an excellent follow-up to Twitch of the Death Nerve, even if I like Twitch of the Death for maybe a little bit more, just because I think that one's a little stranger and more unique. They're both fantastic, and honestly I could see a lot of people enjoying Flesh for the Cannibal God a whole lot more because of the real drums and whatnot. But Job, I hear you saying, I don't have time to listen to a friggin' 30-track grindcore album, is too much. Don't worry, Blue Holocaust has got you covered, because all the new stuff within the past few years has been split 7 inches. And on each of his sides of those splits, he'll concentrate on an even more niche style of Italian filmmaking to render in grindcore form. For instance, on the After the Fall of Man split he did with Morgue Breath, he's all about replicating the atmosphere of post-apocalyptic Italian cinema.
The world is dead. It raped itself. But I'll purify it with blood!
And he kind of mimics those post-apocalyptic landscapes with a slight change to Blue Holocaust's overall sound on this album, with a much drier sort of guitar tone, and an even heavier emphasis on percussive riffs, even incorporating a little bit of a bolt thrower type shit that he hadn't really done before, which I've always associated with sort of a Mad Max sort of atmosphere. Maybe that's just me. But of course, just like all Blue Holocaust, all of that suspended in this giant, miasmatic, super grindcore. I think my favorite split, at least in terms of lyrical theme out of all these, is the one that he did with Chicago Grind Time, entitled Nilbog Attack. That's right, he made a frickin' grindcore concept 7-inch about this movie.
They're eating her! And then they're going to eat me! Oh my God!
The album cover is particularly humorous because, as we all know, Nilbog is Goblin spelled backwards. So he took the logo for Goblin, that band that did all those soundtracks to those Giallo movies, and flipped it backwards. I mean, you gotta respect an album that brings out the Tro Tool samples, if nothing else.
And you can't piss on hospitality. I won't allow it!
As you might expect given the subject matter, this split is particularly filthy sounding even for Blue Holocaust. A really juicy sort of distortion to it.
Look at all that juice!
The vocals this time around are also particularly nasty sounding, which is definitely, again, very befitting of the material. Overall, I'd say Blue Holocaust produces grindcore classics on par with the greats of yesteryear, and he's got a pretty unique sound to boot. Pretty much all of his material is available for, like, name your price on Bandcamp. The only thing on there that costs money, I think, is if you buy a CD of the second album. So you should go out and get that shit if it sounds interesting to you. But even if it didn't, thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Of age goth chick that's biologically female, and it's going to be consensual, and she'll be alive.